In the Concise Guide to Jazz, Mark Gridley says there are two elements that he deems essential to jazz: improvisation and the swing feel. It's difficult to argue with those when you first think about them because they seem to be there in most of jazz. But the key word is most. If we're going to have an essential element, wouldn't it be in all of it? How do we have something that would say, this is what jazz is, except for this? And these exceptions tend to bother me a bit. And so I want you to know these elements. They're very, very important. But let's talk about these. First of all, improvisation. Improvisation is there in almost all jazz. Almost all, that's the key word. But don't forget, we have improvisation in all types of music. My gosh, bluegrass, blues, tons of rock and roll, jam bands. I mean, what are we doing? We're improvising. So the very act of improvising by itself doesn't mean that it has jazz. That's true. Are there musics that are jazz that don't improvise? Well, in fact, yeah, there are. Duke Ellington wrote parts of his suites where everything's written out. All right? There's no jazz in certain movements. There's no improvisation in certain movements. But everything else sounds like jazz. What if we have a big band sound, all right, and we've got all this stuff going on and they're writing like crazy, great stuff, and ensemble playing and sax solos, and is that not jazz until we get to the solo section? What if we just took those solos out? So it was a piece of jazz, but now it's no longer a piece of jazz? So I don't think that, even though we find improvisation in almost all jazz, I don't think that that's the key ingredient that makes jazz jazz. It exists in elements other than jazz, musics other than jazz, and a lot of music sounds like jazz, even if it doesn't have improvisation in it. What about swing? Well, from the beginning of jazz until certainly into the 60s, no issue. A little issue, actually, because we started doing Latin jazz back in the 40s. A couple very big, important pieces. And even though Latin jazz didn't become a primary part of jazz until the 60s, the fact is that, when people such as Dizzy Gillespie and Horace Silver started writing these pieces of music that included a lot of Latin elements, well, Latin music does not swing, not in the way that we consider it to be swing. Now, I know that Mark says that, well, they kind of have a swingy type of thing, but that's mishmash. I don't know what he's talking about. All right? Let's call swing what it is. It's an uneven representation of an eighth note. Latin music doesn't do it. Jazz fusion doesn't do it. All right? So, those aren't jazz musics? Well, I think they are. All right? So, I need to go to another set of definitions. Let's talk about this in two ways. One is, rather than say jazz is this, perhaps what we need is just a menu. And we say that, as long as it's got a certain number of elements of this, then we're going to call it jazz. We have 7 different elements, and if it's got 4 of them, we're going to call it jazz. Some people go for that, some people don't. Some people still look for essential elements. If I'm going to have essential elements, I'm going to have 2, but they're not Mark Gridley's. The first one I would have is jazz articulations. An articulation is how we start a note, how we play it, sometimes how we end it. An articulation in jazz is the same as it is in speech. And when we talk, we enunciate words in different ways. We can kind of play them longer, speak them longer. We can cut them kind of short if we want to, right? We can leave some space there. We can smooth it out if we want to, and we can take our time. Sometimes we want to emphasize these things, but other times we want it to be more soothing. What do we not like? Well, we generally do not like a lack of variation in articulations. We don't really want to hear people who talk like this all the time, do we? That kind of robotish talk. And we don't really want to be lulled to sleep by the person with the monotone type of sound. I'm trying to take all articulation out. Is it possible to just have a type of talking where you have so little inflection in what you do? Wow, that puts us to sleep. What do we have in jazz? We have personalized articulations. We don't have that had a swing beat to it, swing feel. This is the way a lot of beginning improvisers sound. What's wrong with that? There's no articulation. There's no personality. What a great sound that is. We hear it instantly. We have a personality. The beautiful thing about articulation is that even though we have, a certain set types of articulation that are part of jazz or any type of music, we can do with them what we want. And it's that sense of articulation in some ways that makes Louis Armstrong sound like he is. And it makes Dizzy Gillespie sound differently. It makes Bill Evans sound different from Chick Corea. And it makes Chick Corea sound different from Herbie Hancock. And Earl Hines sound different, It's what makes Earl Hines sound different. What makes Ella Fitzgerald sound different from Billie Holiday in so many ways. That sense of articulation. And the fact is, I don't know of any piece that I call jazz. I can't think of a one where that sense of articulation isn't clearly present. Mark Ridley has two elements of jazz he considers essential. Swing feel, improvisation. They're really important. You want to know those. But I also want you to know Ron Newman's essentials of jazz. Articulation, and the second one is jazz chords. Jazz chords. What's a chord? Well, we can have three notes. And that suffices for a lot of music. But that doesn't sound like jazz. I can't make those three notes sound like jazz. Why not? I can swing them, I can articulate them, but they won't sound like jazz. Because jazz uses all these upper extensions of the chord. Right there are 7 different notes. I've got certain chords that I'll play that have 9 different notes in it. I don't need to play those on every one. I don't need to make it that thick. But I have that option. But if I don't include enough of those, it doesn't sound like jazz. What does jazz sound like? Sound and you think that's jazzy sound, and I agree. I don't even have to have them that thick of a chord. I can use a lot less notes, but I got to pick the notes carefully to sound like jazz. Thinner chords, but all these extra notes, non-triad tones, the upper partials. I don't know of any jazz that doesn't use it. Certainly nothing that I would call jazz, and I've got this huge element that I call jazz. If it's primarily a rock tune, but it starts using chords like that, I consider it jazz. But in fact, a lot of rock music uses a lot of jazz elements. That's one of them that's generally missing, except from a very few groups. So Ron Newman's elements of jazz, articulation, jazz chords. I think those are the essential ones.